Okay, this is going to be a quick tutorial on Adobe Lightroom 5 and just the basics on how to import photos, how to edit photos, how to do some basic things like that. So let's get started. So the first thing we need to do, obviously, is import some photos. When you open up Lightroom, it's obviously going to look different from mine, as I have close to 10,000 photos in here. Yours might be empty if this is the first time opening it. But regardless, make sure that you're on the library module right here, and then we'll import some photos. Today we're just going to go over library and develop. There's these other modules, map and book, slideshow, things like that, but that'll be in a separate tutorial. So first what you're going to want to do is come down here to the bottom left-hand corner and click on import. And if you'll notice up here, there's a whole bunch of options. So I personally prefer to copy photos directly from my camera to a folder on my hard drive first, and then I import those photos from that folder on my hard drive. Lightroom has a whole bunch of options, so you can directly copy pictures from, say, an SD card into Lightroom. You can move them from a card. I don't recommend that. There's a couple options, but yours is going to look different depending on what you want to do. So you can come up here and you can select the source. I don't have a source right now as I've already imported the pictures that we're going to be using. One thing I do recommend though is that you check this little box that says build smart previews. So for my computer, I'm using a MacBook Pro with a solid state drive, which means it's fast, but it doesn't have a lot of hard drive space. So I choose to save my photos on an external hard drive. The only downside to that is that when I'm out and about, I don't bring my hard drive with me, but I find myself wanting to edit pictures. So if I select this option when I import photos, that gives me the ability to edit images even when I don't have my hard drive. What it does is it creates a small file that I can still edit and change, and when I get back to my hard drive, I can plug it in and those changes are synced automatically. So once you select the photos that you want and you select the options that you want, go ahead and click import. What it's going to do is it's going to import them into this section that says all photographs. Your oldest pictures will be at the top and your most recent pictures will be at the bottom. So now I'm going to explain the difference between a catalog and collections. If you're somewhat familiar with iTunes, it kind of works the same way that iTunes works with playlists. So for example, in iTunes, you have your entire music library, but let's say you want to create a playlist that's just for, say, workout music. So what you would do is you'd create a new playlist and you would drag and drop specific songs into that playlist. Now when you move them from your library into that playlist, it doesn't move them from the library. All it does is create a smaller selection so it's easier to work with and you don't have to dig through a whole bunch of songs that aren't necessarily for working out. So the way that catalogs and collections work are the same way. So your catalog is basically like your iTunes library and your collections are like your playlists. So what you can do is you can click here on the little plus and go create collection, and then you can name it whatever you want. So here we'll name test collection, and it'll show up down here, and you can click and you can highlight multiple ones. You can do whatever you want. We'll just select these and then drag it into your test collection. Then you click on your test collection and all of these pictures are right here for you to manipulate and do whatever you want with, but you're not bothered with all the clutter of having all of your photos. So I'm going to delete this really quick because for this tutorial I already have a collection made with the photos that we're going to be using, and it's called Lightroom Tutorial. So if you look at these pictures, they're a bunch of random ones, and I purposely tried to pick bad pictures so that I can show the power of Lightroom. So don't think I'm a terrible photographer. So first what we're going to do is we're going to sort our images. So let's say you just got back from a photo shoot and you shot 300 pictures. So there's a lot that you want to go through, and Lightroom is great for that. So what we're going to do is we're going to double click on this photo, and I like this picture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push P, And what that does is it flags it as a pic. You notice that that little dialog box came up. So what that means is I selected that and I want to use that later on. Let's go to this photo. I like this one as well. It obviously needs some work. There's some dark shadows, but we can work with it. So I'm going to use that as a pic as well. I'm going to use this one as a pic, this one as well. This one is a bad picture. They're not looking. They're making funny faces. So I'm going to push the X key, and as you notice, it'll say set as rejected. So we'll keep going. I like this one. I like this one. I don't like this one. Obviously, it's out of focus. It's dark. It's not a very good photograph. Next, the focus is all wrong, so we're going to reject this. This is a boring picture, so we'll reject that. This one I'm going to use. This one I'm not. I'll use this one as well, and that one as well. So now if you notice, down here on the timeline, the ones that we rejected are kind of grayed out. They're almost transparent, but the ones that we want and set as pics have this white border around it. So now what we can do is hit the G key, and what that does is it stands for grid. G is for grid, and it takes us back here. So now that I rejected these photos, I don't want to see them anymore because they're just clutter. So what I can do is I can come up here to the top right corner and say flagged. And what that does is it only shows the pictures that we selected as pics. Let me turn this off really quick. There's a whole bunch of other ways that you can rate pictures. For example, you can use stars, you can use colors, there's all sorts of things. Let me click on this one. So here's the star rating. I just personally prefer the rejected and the pics as it's easier, but you can have all sorts of different rating systems. So I mean, we can set flags, we can set ratings, colors. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll say red means, oh, it's ready to go on my blog, and now it's colored in red. Or I can come in here and I can say, oh, this one is, it needs a little bit more work. So things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn these off. Okay, and I'll come in here to flagged again. So now I want to demonstrate the power of Lightroom and the editing capabilities that it has. So once we've clicked on a picture, you know, I can see information about it and I can do a few things, but what we really want to do is we want to go to this develop panel. That's where we have all the power. So for this particular photo, it was taken indoors. It had pretty flat, boring lighting, and so I had to bump my ISO up pretty high to get a decent shutter speed. But as you know, when we're at a high ISO, if we zoom in here, there's a lot of grain on this photograph. So one thing that Lightroom is really good at is getting rid of noise. So on the right panel over here, if we scroll down, yours might be minimized like this. Double or go ahead and click on the little arrow next to detail, and then it'll come down here, and what we're going to play with is noise reduction. So if you take this luminance slider, and it depends on the photo, but for this one I'm going to use about a 50. And if you notice, that takes out all of the noise. If you hit the backslash key, the one directly underneath the delete key, if you hit that, you can go to the before and after photos and toggle back and forth to see that. So it's really good at removing noise. The only problem is that when you remove noise, your photos become fairly soft. And so we can come in here to the sharpening and just change the amount. And again, you don't want to go crazy, but I'll do, say, 46. That'll work well. And so when we zoom back out, then we get rid of a lot of the noise that we had. Moving on to the next photo, let's look at this one. So this was a picture we took out shooting. As you can tell, the sky is blown out. So what we can do is we can mess with the highlights here. One thing that's really neat about Lightroom is the histogram has a lot of information. So for example, if we come up here to this arrow and we hover over it, as you can see, there's red that shows up on the sky. And that means that there's data that's unrecoverable there. That means there's the sky was too blown out. And again, we can also, let me do this. Let me make the picture super dark. If we hover over this one, you see that she turns blue, which means that the photo is too dark and that the data is not recoverable there either. So what we're going to do is we're going to play with the shadows. We're going to lighten up her face. and you can turn up fairly high, but I'm also going to try and recover some of the information that's in the sky. Obviously there's not a lot left, but we can bring it down so it's not so overbearing. I'm also going to bump up the exposure a little bit, not too much, we don't want to wash her out. One thing that's nice about Lightroom too is sometimes these sliders can be kind of imprecise. And so what you can do is if you just click on the slider, instead of dragging, you can use your up and down arrow keys to make more precise adjustments. I'm also going to add a little bit of contrast, just so her face doesn't look so soft. And this picture also looks a little bit cold to me, so I'm going to warm it up just ever so slightly. Not a lot, you don't want to go crazy. You can either adjust the temperature, but there's also these white balance presets that are similar to Canon cameras, if that's what you're using. So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and move on to the next photo. These are just some pictures of ducks taken at the nature park. This looks a little bit underexposed to me, so I'm going to drag the exposure up. I really love this photo. I love how sharp it looks. You can see the individual hairs on the duck's fur. But one thing that does bug me is that he has these specks of dirt. So similar to Photoshop, there is a healing brush tool. It doesn't work as well, but it still does a pretty good job. If we click up right here is the circle with this right arrow. We want to make sure that we're on the heel, and then we can move out and we can just click and get rid of these spots. We can use the left and right bracket keys to make the brush size bigger or smaller, just like you would in Photoshop, or you can also drag these down here, whichever is easier. So you just go ahead and click, and what Lightroom will do is it'll try and find a match that doesn't look too out of the norm. And sometimes most of the time it does a pretty good job. Occasionally you'll get kind of a strange one. Let's say it tried to do that. If we turn this off, obviously you can see that that doesn't look very good. There's just a strange blob right there. So you can actually move this yourself, and you can choose the area that you want to sample from. If you don't like that at all, you can click back here and just hit the delete key and it'll go away. But most of the time it does a pretty good job. And when we're done, we can close that and zoom back out. And there you go. Next, I kind of demonstrated this already. This photo is a little bit warm to me. It was taken under some fluorescent lighting, and I thought I had changed my white balance in camera, but I guess I didn't. So let's cool it off just a little bit, not a ton. That looks pretty good. If we hover over here, though, we can see that the sign and the keys have a lot of blown out highlights, even a little bit on the base up here, the lamp. What we can do is we can come and bring down the highlights just ever so slightly, not a ton. And it looks like we took care of that pretty well. This photo here is pretty good. I'm going to bump up the exposure, warm it up just a tad. But what I really want to do is crop this, because she's right in the center of the frame. It doesn't really follow the rule of thirds very well. So I'm going to crop this, and we can just click here. What I like to do is I like to lock this, because if I don't, then I can crop it all weird and there's no constraints on it. And when you go to print, then you can get some letterboxing and it just kind of looks funky. So I like to lock this. If you want, you can leave it as the same constraints as the original photograph size, or you can crop it to like an 8x10 or a 5x7, and it'll do that for you, and it'll lock it so you can't drag it weird. Let's say I'm cropping like this and I want to make it portrait versus landscape. I can hit the X key and then I'll change it. What's great about Lightroom too is everything is non-destructive. So let's say I hit enter and I save this crop, close out of Lightroom, and then a year from now I come back and say, oh, why did I do that? You know, that's terrible. Nothing's lost. I can come just back in here, click on the crop tool, and everything is saved. I can change it however I want. So I'm going to reset this. and I'm going to lock this, but what I am going to do is I'm going to crop it just so that she's right on that third line right there, and that makes for a little bit more interesting photo. This photograph, same thing. One thing I don't like though is her skin looks a little bit blown out, a little bit red. So Lightroom has some basic skin editing features. They're not amazing, but if you just need some quick editing done, then it's great. Photoshop obviously has more control, but these do pretty well. So we're gonna come up here and click on the adjustment brush. And the adjustment brush has a lot of presets, but for this one we're going to use skin softening. So if we click on this, we get a brush again. We're going to make it a little bit smaller. If we hold shift as well as the left and right brackets, we can also choose the feathering on that brush. And then what you do is you just start painting, and it's very subtle, but it makes a big difference, and it doesn't look overdone, and you don't go crazy. Sometimes though it's hard to see where you've painted and you get lost. So what you can do is you can check this little box, and now it'll show in red everywhere that you've painted. The shortcut for that is O as well. So if you toggle O, it'll toggle that red overlay on and off. But we can just start painting. And again, it's all non-destructive. So let's say I go a little bit over, and dang, I didn't mean to do that. What you can do is you can hold Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC, and if you notice, our brush changes to a minus instead of a plus, and you can just unpaint everything that you did. It's similar to working with masks in Photoshop, but you don't have to deal with all the different layers and things like that. So we can even come down here, we can make our brush a little bit bigger, we can do her arm, doesn't have to be too crazy precise, and just like that. So I'm going to hit O and turn that off, and that looks pretty good. Another thing we can do is we can widen up her teeth a little bit. So let's, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Let's do a new brush. Make sure you select new, and then let's come in here, make the brush a little bit smaller. I am going to turn on that overlay so I can see where I've painted. Just like that. Hit O again. And so you have a lot of control right here. So we can make her teeth super white, but obviously that looks a little scary. You don't want to overdo it. Let's do something like that. And when we zoom back out, it looks pretty good. We can come in here. Again, let's say we overdo it and we want to come back a year later and say, oh, her teeth are just a little bit too white. We can come in here and just change the exposure. You can darken things up, really however you want to do. Again, there's also iris enhance, so you can sharpen up her eyes a little bit. Obviously, I'd use a smaller brush to be a little bit more precise, things like that, but that all works pretty well. Another thing that's really great about Lightroom is it has a lot of editing features for color. So what we can do is we can come back here to the basics panel, and what we can do is we can either pump up the vibrance so all of the colors as a whole will be enhanced, and that looks pretty good. Or let's say we just want to select, say, the sky. Let's say we want our sky to be really blue. What we can do is we can come over here to the HSL color black and white and make sure that this triangle is in the down position. So HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. So we want to make sure that we're on the saturation panel. And then we can come in here and just select the color that we want and just pump that up. And as you notice, it doesn't mess with the greens or the browns in the photograph. Sometimes what'll happen is I'll try and say, oh, I think this is a brown color. And I come in here and I try and mess with the colors, but I just can't get it. So what's nice is there's this little tool, it's like the crosshairs. And what you can do is you can click and hold and drag, and it'll select the color for you, so you don't have to mess with it. Some colors are a mixture, so say there's some orange, it looks like there's some yellows in here. So I just desaturated it, but if you click and drag, you can also drag upwards, and you can add more color to the photograph depending on how much you want or need. So it's really pretty cool. Obviously you don't want to overdo it again, but we can drag this up, add some more color. So that just gives you a little bit more control on selecting one color rather than the whole thing if you want to do it that way. Moving on to another photograph. This is a house that I shot, and it was really hard. The lighting was super harsh. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and so there's a lot of deep shadows, but really a bunch of highlights as well. So this is where Lightroom really shines. Let's bump down the highlights just so it's not quite so intense, but I also want to see that front door and the glass, and so I can bump up the shadows as well. I also want a little bit more contrast, so let's do that. A little clarity, just so it's a little bit sharper. We can come down here to the detail panel, add a little bit of sharpening, and then I really want that sky to pop, so I'm going to drag that just like that. And again, we can see the before and after by hitting the backslash and see the before and after, and it's a pretty drastic difference. So here's a photo that I really like, but I totally butchered it. The color is off. You can see the shadows here. You can see the highlights are up here. It's a good picture of Kayla, but I just did a terrible job with the fill flash. But that doesn't mean that it's lost. So what I'm going to do is I am going to do an adjustment brush, and we want to change this to exposure. Actually, before I do that, what I want to do is I want to edit the whole picture. So I'm going to come in here and bump up the exposure, and I'm going to worry more about her and not about the highlights right now because we can fix those later. So I'm going to bump up the exposure, and it's still a little bit cold, so I'm going to warm up the photo just a little bit so it looks good. And then what I can do is I can come here with this adjustment brush, and I am going to make it a little bigger. And then again, I'm going to hit O to show that overlay, and I'm going to paint right on those highlights and just get rid of that grass that's overexposed and has kind of a distraction from the rest of the photo. I'll hit O again to turn that off, but what I can do is I can change the exposure so it's not quite so distracting, just like that. Also, what I can do is, let's say I want to underexpose the background, so we'll do something like that. We really want Kayla to pop still, so what we can do is come here and do another exposure. I'll do O, and I'm going to paint all over her, and we'll make the brush nice and big. And just paint over every part of her. Make sure we don't miss anything. Just like that. I'll hit O, and then I'm going to bump up the exposure again so that she's really bright. And we're starting to get this kind of this strange halo effect around her hair, so we can make the brush size a little bit smaller, and we can just go back and make sure that she doesn't have quite so much bright around her hair. So again, there's a lot of fine tweaking that we can do, but that's a much better photograph than it was before. If we look at the before, where I completely ruined it, you know, we can actually save a photograph that might not otherwise been able to use. I'm going to crop it in a little bit more just so that third line is right on her eye. We can come in here again and use some of the other adjustment brushes that we have. Let's do some teeth whitening. And let's just kind of paint over that. We don't want to go too crazy. Do a new brush. Do some sharpening on her eyes. Her skin actually looks pretty good. There's a little blemish right here. I'm going to do that. But really, you know, it's a pretty good photo. There's a big difference. The last thing I want to do is show you the lens correction options in Lightroom. So every lens has distortion no matter what it is, whether it's a 50 millimeter, prime lenses all have it, zoom lenses all have it. There's always going to be some distortion no matter what lens you're using. What's great about Lightroom is it has profiles already included with it that will correct that for you. So if this photo was shot in Moab this last weekend, and it was shot with an ultra wide 17 to 40 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. So while it looks fine, it doesn't look like there's any distortion, this lens actually has a lot of barrel distortion. What I can do is I can select this, and what it does is it removes all of that distortion. What's great is Lightroom can detect which lens was used to take this photograph. So if you wanted to, you can select it manually, select a different one, but obviously this was the lens I used, so I'm going to do that. A lot of the time, for example, on the 50 millimeter, there's a lot of vignetting, kind of those dark corners that you see, some chromatic aberrations. And so we can use that to get rid of a lot of distortion easier. So those are just some basic edits. Lightroom has a ton of features. There's masking features and gradients and red eye removal, and there's all sorts of different capabilities that it has that I won't cover in this tutorial, but that should get you started. One last thing before we go is Lightroom can't do everything. And for a lot of things, especially when you're working with layers and complicated things like that, you still need to use Photoshop. But what's nice is Lightroom and Photoshop are integrated so well that you can actually right-click on any image in Lightroom and go edit in Adobe Photoshop. And the reason this is grayed out is because I don't have my hard drive connected. But you can edit them in Photoshop, and whenever as soon as you save the file in Photoshop, what will happen is it'll automatically re-import that changed photo into Lightroom for you. It'll be right down here next to the original photo, and so you have both copies, and it's easy to go back and forth. Good luck. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll be happy to help. Thanks.